The wind cut through Ezra Blackwood like a blade as he rode into Millhaven, his horse's hooves echoing hollow against the frozen ground. 3 days without food had carved deep lines into his weathered face, and the December cold seemed to seep straight into his bones. The town stretched before him like a collection of wooden bones bleached white by winter, most windows dark against the early evening gloom. His stomach twisted with familiar hunger as he guided his mare toward what looked like a general store. The painted sign hung crooked, creaking in the bitter wind. Ezra had ridden through dozens of towns just like this one, never staying longer than necessary, never looking back. Food, supplies, and then the trail again. That was how he survived. If you want to see how this cowboy's simple stop for supplies changes everything, hit that subscribe button, because what happens next will transform both their lives forever. But as he dismounted, tying his reins to the hitching post with numb fingers, movement caught his eye. Across the street, a woman struggled with an armload of belongings, her thin shawl no match for the wind that whipped her dark hair across her face. She stumbled, and something inside Ezra stirred. Ezra watched as the woman's bundles scattered across the muddy street, papers and fabric catching in the wind like desperate birds. She dropped to her knees, frantically gathering her possessions before they could blow away completely. Her movements held a particular kind of desperation he recognized, the careful urgency of someone who owned nothing they could afford to lose. Without thinking, he found himself crossing the street. His boots crunched through patches of ice as he knelt beside her, catching a wayward piece of cloth before it could escape into the gathering darkness. Up close, he could see the exhaustion etched into her delicate features, the way her hands trembled not just from cold but from something deeper. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the wind. Her eyes met his for just a moment, wide and startling green, before she looked away again. Ezra felt something shift in his chest, an unfamiliar tightness that had nothing to do with hunger. He helped her gather the last of her belongings, noting how she clutched them protectively against her chest. She wore no wedding ring, he noticed, and her dress, though clean and carefully mended, spoke of hard times and harder choices. When she stood, she swayed slightly, and Ezra instinctively reached out to steady her. "I am Cordelia Ashworth," she said quietly, pulling her shawl tighter around her shoulders. The wind caught her words and carried them between them like a secret. "Ezra Blackwood," he replied, touching the brim of his hat. The simple exchange of names felt strangely significant in the emptiness of the frozen street. Cordelia nodded once, a gesture that somehow conveyed both gratitude and dismissal, as if she expected him to walk away now that politeness had been satisfied. But something about the way she held herself, proud despite her obvious circumstances, made him hesitate. The general store could wait another few minutes. "You heading somewhere warm?" he asked, noting how the wind seemed to cut right through her thin clothing. Cordelia's laugh held no humor. "The boarding house put me out this morning. Seems my credit is no longer good in this town." She adjusted her grip on her bundle, and Ezra caught sight of what looked like sewing supplies, ribbons, and scraps of fine fabric. A seamstress, then trying to make her way in a place that clearly had little use for her skills. The wind picked up again, sending snow devils spiraling down the street. Ezra watched Cordelia brace herself against the cold, and something in her quiet endurance reminded him of his own mother, years ago, when pride was all that stood between dignity and despair. His stomach growled, reminding him of his own needs, but he found himself unable to simply walk away. "There's a cafe down the street," he said carefully. "Looks like they might still be serving." His words hung in the air between them, an offer neither quite ready to name. Cordelia studied his face for a long moment, as if trying to read the intentions behind his weathered features. Ezra had learned long ago that people usually saw what they expected to see when they looked at him. A drifter, a man who lived outside the boundaries of respectable society. But something in her green eyes suggested she was looking deeper, past the rough exterior to whatever lay beneath. "I cannot pay for a meal," she said finally, her voice steady despite the admission. There was no shame in her tone, just the practical honesty of someone who had learned to navigate the world without illusions. Ezra felt his stomach clench again, but not from hunger this time. "Didn't ask you to," he replied quietly. A man gets tired of eating alone. It was only partly true, but it seemed to ease something in her expression. The cafe's windows glowed warm yellow against the approaching darkness, promising shelter from the bitter wind that continued to tear through the street. Cordelia glanced toward the light, then back at him, and he could see her weighing choices, calculating risks. Trust did not come easily to a woman alone in a town that had already turned its back on her. "Very well," she said at last, her voice carrying a mixture of gratitude and wariness. "But only because the alternative is freezing to death in this wind." She managed a small smile that transformed her entire face, and Ezra felt that strange tightness in his chest again. The cafe's warmth enveloped them like an embrace as they stepped inside, the sudden change from bitter cold making Cordelia's cheeks flush pink. Ezra guided her to a corner table away from the curious stares of the few other patrons, men who looked at him with the casual suspicion reserved for strangers, and at her with something approaching disapproval. The proprietor, a heavy-set woman with flour-dusted hands, approached their table with obvious reluctance. "We close in an hour," she announced, her tone suggesting they were not particularly welcome. Ezra ordered stew and bread for both of them, ignoring the woman's pointed glance at Cordelia. When the food arrived, Ezra watched Cordelia eat with the careful restraint of someone accustomed to making meals last. She took small bites, chewing slowly, and he realized she was probably hungrier than he was. The thought stirred something protective in him, an unfamiliar urge to shield her from the hardships that had clearly marked her recent days. "You mentioned sewing," he said quietly, nodding toward the bundle she kept close beside her chair. Cordelia paused, her spoon halfway to her lips. "I made dresses for the banker's wife and the preacher's daughter back in Cedar Falls," she replied, "before my husband died and the debts came due." Her voice held no self-pity, just the flat acceptance of someone who had learned that life rarely unfolded according to plan. Ezra set down his spoon, studying her face in the lamplight. Cedar Falls was 2 days' hard ride south, a prosperous town where a seamstress might make a decent living if the circumstances were right. The fact that she had traveled so far with so little spoke of desperation deeper than simple poverty. "My husband was a good man, but a poor judge of business partners," Cordelia continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "When he died, I discovered that our savings had disappeared along with his partner. The creditors came quickly." She traced the rim of her bowl with one finger, the gesture somehow conveying years of careful planning undone by betrayal and loss. Ezra felt a familiar anger stir in his chest, the same rage that had driven him from his own home years ago when men with power had decided his family's fate. But this was different somehow, more personal. He found himself wanting to ride back to Cedar Falls and hunt down the partner who had stolen this woman's security. "Where will you go now?" he asked, though he suspected she had no answer. Cordelia looked up at him then, and he saw something flicker in her green eyes, a vulnerability she quickly tried to hide. "I thought perhaps the next town west might have need of a seamstress," she said, but her voice lacked conviction. They both knew that winter travel alone would be suicide, and her resources were clearly exhausted. The silence stretched between them as the weight of her situation settled over the small table. Outside, the wind rattled the cafe windows, reminding them both of the harsh reality waiting beyond these warm walls. Ezra had spent years perfecting the art of walking away, of not getting involved in other people's troubles. It was how he had survived since leaving home, keeping his heart carefully guarded against exactly this kind of complication. But something about Cordelia Ashworth had already slipped past his defenses. Maybe it was the way she maintained her dignity despite everything, or the quiet strength in her voice when she spoke of loss. Whatever it was, he found himself unable to simply finish his meal and walk away. "I have a cabin," he said suddenly, the words surprising them both. "About a day's ride north. It is not much, but it is warm and there is enough food to last the winter." The offer hung in the air between them, fraught with implications neither was quite ready to examine. Cordelia's spoon clattered against her bowl as her hand trembled slightly. "Mr. Blackwood, I cannot possibly," she began, but he held up a hand to stop her. "You would be doing me the favor," he said quietly. A man gets tired of talking to his horse and the wind. He managed a small smile that softened his weathered features. "And that sewing skill might come in handy. My clothes have seen better days." Cordelia stared at him for a long moment, searching his face for any hint of deception or ulterior motive. Ezra met her gaze steadily, letting her see whatever truth she needed to find there. He understood her caution. A woman alone had to be careful about the men who offered help, especially when that help came with isolation and dependence. "You do not know me," she said finally, her voice barely audible above the crackling of the cafe's small fireplace. "I could be a thief, or worse." There was something almost desperate in her attempt to give him reasons to withdraw the offer, as if she feared hoping for salvation only to have it snatched away. Ezra leaned back in his chair, considering her words. "You are a widow who loved her husband enough to honor his debts even when his partner betrayed you both. You are skilled with your hands and proud enough to work rather than beg." He paused, watching her face. "And you're kind enough to worry about a stranger's safety rather than just accepting his help." The proprietor approached their table again, this time with barely concealed hostility. "We are closing now," she announced, beginning to clear away their empty bowls with unnecessary force. Ezra placed a few coins on the table, more than the simple meal was worth, and stood. "The decision is yours, Miss Ashworth," he said quietly, extending his hand to help her from her chair. "But the offer stands." Cordelia rose slowly, gathering her bundle with careful deliberation. The cafe felt suddenly oppressive, the proprietor's disapproving stare and the wind's insistent howling creating a pressure that seemed to push against her from all sides. She looked toward the door, then back at Ezra, weighing impossible choices in the span of heartbeats. "I accept," she said quietly, the words seeming to surprise her as much as they did him. "But I insist on earning my keep. I will not be a burden or charity case." Her chin lifted slightly, that familiar pride reasserting itself even in the face of her desperate circumstances. Ezra nodded, understanding that her dignity was as essential to her survival as food or shelter. "Wouldn't expect anything less," he replied, pulling on his worn coat. The wind hit them like a physical blow as they stepped outside, and Cordelia instinctively moved closer to his solid presence. They walked toward the livery stable in companionable silence, their footsteps crunching through the snow that had begun to fall more heavily. Ezra could feel the weight of curious eyes watching from behind curtained windows, the kind of scrutiny that followed strangers in small towns. But for the first time in years, he found himself caring less about what others thought and more about the woman walking beside him. "My horse can carry us both," he said as they reached the stable. The ride to Ezra's cabin stretched longer than expected as the snow began falling in earnest, transforming the familiar trail into a treacherous path of hidden rocks and uncertain footing. Cordelia sat behind him on the horse, her arms wrapped carefully around his waist for balance, and he could feel her shivering despite the heavy coat he had insisted she wear over her thin shawl. The cabin emerged from the swirling snow like something from a dream, small but solid, with smoke already rising from the chimney where he had banked the fire before leaving that morning. Cordelia's sharp intake of breath told him she had not expected anything quite so welcoming, and he felt an unexpected surge of pride in the home he had built with his own hands. "It is beautiful," she whispered as he helped her down from the horse, her voice filled with something approaching wonder. The simple log structure, chinked against the winter wind and surrounded by towering pines, represented more than shelter to someone who had spent recent weeks wondering where she would lay her head each night. Ezra felt something shift inside his chest as he watched her take in the sight of his refuge, seeing it through her eyes for the first time. He had built this place as a retreat from the world, a sanctuary where he could exist without judgment or expectation. But suddenly it felt like something else entirely, like the beginning of a life he had never dared imagine for himself. Inside the cabin, warmth from the stone fireplace wrapped around them like an embrace, and Cordelia stood in the center of the simple room, taking in the rough-hewn furniture and carefully tended details that spoke of a man who had made a real home despite his solitary existence. Hand-carved shelves lined one wall, filled with books whose worn spines suggested frequent reading, and colorful quilts softened the stark functionality of the space. "This is your work," she said, running her fingers along the smooth surface of a wooden table, recognizing the careful craftsmanship in every joint and curve. Ezra nodded, suddenly self-conscious about the humble surroundings that had always seemed adequate for his needs alone. Over the following days, as the snow continued to fall and trap them in comfortable isolation, Cordelia proved true to her word about earning her keep. She mended his clothes with delicate stitches that transformed worn fabric into something approaching elegance, cooked meals that filled the cabin with rich aromas he had almost forgotten, and brought a gentle presence that somehow made the space feel larger rather than smaller. But it was the quiet moments that undid him completely. The way she hummed softly while working, or how she looked up from her sewing with a smile that seemed to light the entire room. Ezra found himself watching her hands as she worked, listening for her footsteps, and slowly admitting what he had been fighting since that first moment in the street. Spring arrived with unexpected gentleness, melting the snow that had held them captive in their perfect isolation. Ezra stood in the doorway, watching Cordelia tend the small garden she had coaxed from the thawed earth, her movements graceful and sure as she worked among the emerging green shoots. 6 months had passed since that desperate night in Millhaven, and everything had changed. Cordelia Blackwood, he said softly, testing the sound of her new name on his tongue. She looked up at him with eyes that sparkled with joy and mischief, the haunted look of desperate hunger long since replaced by the contentment of a woman who had found her place in the world. The simple ceremony performed by the circuit preacher 3 weeks earlier had been witnessed only by the ancient pines and a curious deer, but it felt more sacred than any grand church wedding. They had spoken their vows with hands clasped and hearts full, promising to build a life together from the ashes of their separate sorrows. Now, as Ezra watched his wife work in their garden, he marveled at the strange turns that had brought them together. He had ridden into Millhaven seeking only food for his body, but he had found nourishment for his soul instead. The drifter who had lived without roots or connections had discovered that home was not a place, but a person, and love was not a weakness, but the greatest strength he had ever known. Have you ever found love in the most unexpected places? Share your story of second chances in the comments below.